Hola clase. Today we are talking about racial formations in the United States, specifically Chapter 3, Nation. It starts on page 75 and it goes until page 102. But a lot of those pages are footnotes there at the end. So this chapter is all about understanding race as a nation construct, something having to do with nationalism, pride for one's racial community. And the chapter starts with an introduction about how we as a country became a nation to begin with, and how the Europeans' conquest of the Western Hemisphere, which would become the United States, was an extension or a practice of, quote, building a nation, and that America as a nation is very much a white nation in the sense that nationalism and any kind of resistance was achieved through overthrowing or controlling or even killing through genocide groups of people, and typically people of color, that were standing in the way of building this, quote, white nation, this U.S. nation. So if you turn to page, that's all talked about a little bit on page 75, the very first page of the reading. And then if you turn to page 76, you'll see in the first full body paragraph at the top, there's a quote about 5 lines in. Slavery, genocide, conquest, and empire all mess with the homogeneity implicit in the concept of a white nation. Immigration and exclusion also call the nation's assumed foundational whiteness into question. There have been various iterations of nativism and legalization, for example, and alternating trajectories of racial reform and backlash. So they're explaining in those few sentences there that building a kind of white U.S. nation has been complicated through these acts that have occurred in history, the slavery, genocide, the conquest, the empire building itself. It destabilizes this notion of homogeneous origins, of being a very white origin. However, if you continue on in the very next paragraph after what I was just reading, it says white rule in North America before and after 1776 has always been riven by racial conflict. The centrality of white male property holders' rules has been both taken for granted and unstable. And then it goes on to talk about how, race has operated on a very multi-level organizing in terms of who is considered civilized and who is considered the savage, who's considered free and who's considered indentured, or the servant or the slave. And as you continue reading 76 through 77, you're going to be really getting a lot of information about how European conquest, Anglo-Saxism, Anglo-conformity, whiteness as nation building, that's all being discussed on pages 76 and 77. And I couldn't help, as I'm reading on page 77, I couldn't help thinking about some of the rhetoric we might hear in political circles about, this notion of, quote, making America great again. Well, when you use a phrase like that, your references is something to the past, historically, and what was it in the past that made America so great, and what is it that you want to continue now into the present that will maintain that historical trajectory. And so I put that little statement right by where it said in the second full body paragraph, it says, not only the turning of Africa into a warren for the commercial hunting of black skins, but also Indian removal, ethnic cleansing and genocide, and hemispheric dominance after the 1823 Monroe Doctrine were established principles by the 19th century. So if you don't know what the Monroe Doctrine is, that is this legal document that said that the West was open for all white Westerners to come and civilize it. It was decreed by God. It was our God-given rights to go west, as from sea to shining sea, and civilize all the indigenous peoples that were along the way. So there was a lot of forced removals. And then, the history in this early pages, they go on to the Bracero programs, mass deportations that were occurring. If you were a U.S. citizen but you looked Mexican, you could be repatriated, which means sent back to, quote, your home country, even if you were a U.S. citizen. So there was a lot of really bad things going on. And when you get into page 78 and 79, really at the very bottom of 78, you're going to see a word that's called peoplehood. So it says what is in question here is, quote, peoplehood. So who makes up a group within a nation? What is their social community identity? That's the peoplehood. And if you go immediately on to 79, at the very top, you're going to see this notion in bold. It's called WASP, W-A-S-P. That means White Anglo-Saxon Protestant. So it was a phrasing that was used contemporarily to describe who our founding fathers were. They were white Anglo-Saxon males that practiced a Protestant religion. They were often land owning. And so when you see that word or acronym WASP, it's just a short reference to a certain group of individuals who had power in building our nation. And then if you continue on at the bottom of 79, under race, class, gender, and nation, you're going to read some discussions about how race, class, gender, and nation intersect, and the way we can consider how a country or a place is developed nationally, or that peoplehood notion. And so they talk a little bit about the Irish. They talk about the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And then they talk about post-Civil War industrialization and that Reconstruction period that I've mentioned. So what you're getting at here is a very detailed historical accounting of nation building. And then the gender aspects get into play at the bottom of 80, which is also talking about how sexual encounters occurred most often through forms of rape or abuse that became another way to build nations. So when you get to 81, we're at a new section heading that is actually, it's a pretty exciting one, and it's definitely very tied to ethnic studies and the formation of our field, and that is what they're calling insurgent nationalism. So that means rising up. Insurgent is to give protest, is to fight back, to rebel against nationalism. And one way this happened through that term peoplehood is that people of color begin to form their own nationalist movements. And that's what we have happening in the 1960s with the civil rights movement. And all the civil rights leaders, some of the big named ones that we know of, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., Bobby Seale, Dolores Huerta, Cesar Chavez, and you'll see some of those names on page 81 in the middle. They're listing people that have redefined what nationhood meant, and they're people of color. And you also get introduced to SNCC, which is SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. That's at the bottom of page 81. And that is a group of black individuals, but really all types of allies coming together to form notions of black power and black pride. So Black Power is discussed at the bottom of 81 with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and it continues on to 82. You're going to read a little bit about Malcolm X and about the Vietnam War. You're going to read a little bit about The Souls of Black Folk by W.E.B. Du Bois. And then there's some really good questions about peoplehood in that very last paragraph on page 82 that I would stress that you look at. And then when we get to 83, there is right in the middle of that page, there's a very small paragraph that says, here we offer an all too brief examination of a few of the main insurgent nationalist approaches to race. So remember that term, insurgent nationalist approach to race. Insurgent meaning to fight back, to be politically moving in a certain direction, and nationalist, building a revolutionary nationalist identity. And there's three ways that they examine in this chapter: Pan-Africanism, cultural nationalism, and a Marxist account of the, quote, national question. So the rest of the chapter is really broken up into looking at those 3 points before we get to the conclusion. So number 1, Pan-Africanism. That is very much associated with the Black Power movement, with Black Pride taking place when the first ethnic studies program ends up getting created at San Francisco State University. At the time it was San Francisco College, and we're going to read more about that. But the definition of Pan-Africanism starts at the bottom of page 83, and it's about reclaiming the connections for Black individuals in the United States with the continent of Africa and the various countries located on that continent. It talks a lot about people who worked with this idea of Pan-Africanism, and specifically at the top of 84 it says, Garvey sought to unite blacks throughout the world and a movement for the redemption of Africa, which he envisioned as a racial empire. So the result of this nation building was to reconnect roots to different countries in Africa, to revision how Africa is perceived globally, as a nationhood continent, and then to reformulate it here in the United States in a empowering move of peoplehood, so to speak. And so then the rest of the pages from 84 to 85 is really just, and you can skim these sections, it's really about talking about the different scholars, the different speakers, the different sources related to that history of Pan-Africanism. And it gets into pretty specific details with a lot of names and quotes being dropped. But I think it's more important just to understand that this happened, like happens and is happening. And then, yes. And the author does end on the Pan-Africanist perspective by saying that it's not as popular anymore. It's lost a little bit of ground, especially since post-apartheid periods, that there's now other issues going on in the continent of Africa regarding civil wars, changing of borders, the competitions looking for copper, petroleum, coltan, different natural resources over on that continent. So then it switches us, if you start at the top of page 86, to cultural nationalism. The roots of cultural nationalism can be traced back to the Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s. And if you never heard of that term, the Harlem Renaissance is a period in time for U.S. that takes place in New York, specifically in Harlem, in which a whole bunch of black authors, black artists, black musicians were gaining popularity and notice and making a difference with their creativity. And that includes such very famous author and poet Langston Hughes. So that's next, talked about probably from 86 through, I would say about 89 before we get into Marxism. And if you're skimming through these pages, I marked a lot of things as key or really valuable to understand, especially with Mecha. If you've never heard of Mecha, it's at the bottom of 87. It's the Movimiento Estudiantil Chicana de Aztlán. And we had a Mecha at most of the schools I went to. And the power in this kind of cultural nationalism, so to speak, is it's how we get invested change in systems of power. And that's talked a lot about at the bottom of 87 through the top of 88 with the birth of ethnic studies programs and the call for hiring more faculty of color and all these manifestos, so to speak, of pride and support for a racial nationhood or peoplehood community. So, although the authors do say at the end of this section that unfortunately much of what was being built and worked upon was commodified and co-opted by other communities. So that means taking pieces of what you like and then using it to promote your own community's artistic capabilities or whatnot. So we end with the Marxist approach, and that starts at the bottom of 89, the national question and Marxism. And really in this section, as you're going on, like say through 90 and 91, it's more about understanding that class aspect, the class and the struggle for production in terms, or in alignment with nationalism and building an empire. And they definitely overlap, because in order to build an empire, you need to have funds and money and labor coming in. And that is what class struggles, Marxist struggles, allowed to happen. So that's what you would be reading on all through 91. They do bring up a really interesting term called internal colonialism. And that begins more towards the bottom of 91. And they explain internal colonization as a geography of culturally dominating a group and the resistance that occurs from that domination. It's a super exploitation movement. That's at the top of page 92. And then finally, it's externally based control, an outsider coming in and saying, well, I can make your country better. I can make America great again if you give me these groups of people to help labor to make it better. So internal colonization is talked a lot at the end here, and I would say that continues until right around 93, because then at the bottom of 93 they talk about another term, which is called hybridity, and racial hybridity comes up. And that really is just an understanding of mixed race or mixedness. When something becomes hybrid, it means it's pulling lots of different aspects, or maybe different different concepts together to create this new form of being. So hybridity can be pretty popular, especially racial hybridity, because then you can belong in multiple groups or communities, and there's more power in that, being able to negotiate between different groups. But some people also feel like it can make you not fully belong in one group or the other, more in the middle. So the end, I know my lectures are always going along. The last couple of pages, 94 through 96, and then the rest are footnotes, is really just the summary again about this nation-based paradigm of race and why it cannot exist, or I mean it can exist, but how it's not the best way to understand a U.S. system of racial oppression. And that starts at the middle of 94. And the key part I marked, and I will end it kind of in two spots. On page 95, right in the first small kind of mini paragraph in the middle of 95. So the nation-based paradigm remains valuable, but cannot capture the complexity of U.S. racial dynamics across the board. In this respect, it parallels the other two paradigms we have discussed. That's the ethnicity-based and the class-based, because it is based on a reductionism of race, in this case, peoplehood. And it reduces everyone in terms of racial complications to building a peoplehood or a community, and race is more complicated than that. That's what the authors are arguing. And again, that's talked about at the bottom or kind of middle of 96, very last page. They give you a big word here called epiphenomenalism. So I circled it. It's right in the middle. And it means treating races of people as a manifestation of their peoplehood, reducing them to something. Thus, it still reduces it to something that is supposedly more fundamental, And then they go on to say that they argue that race is not a mask for something else. It cannot be reduced to a, quote, true national identity of a racialized, categorized group. It cannot be reduced to cultural differences, as ethnicity-based paradigms suggest, and it cannot be reduced to a type of inequality developed through class, as the class-based paradigm suggests. Instead, race contains all of these dimensions and, in fact, exceeds them. So it goes beyond what we can understand in these three categories. So there you have it. This was the end of part 1 of the textbook, kind of the early foundations of race in terms of historical understandings of it. And we will be moving on to part 2, which is how racial formations actually occurred. So if you have any questions, reach out to me via Canvas email. Thank you.